Welcome to everybody. Thank you for your patience, and we're delighted to have a full room here at Dartmouth, an online audience, and speakers both with us and joining us now. Thank you, Corey, remotely. I'm Tori Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. Welcome to tonight's conversation, What Should America Fight For? This will be a dialogue involving issues involving Ukraine, nuclear weapons, and the U.S. global role. So we at the Dickey Center are dedicated to the vision involved with the former president of Dartmouth, John Sloan Dickey, who saw the world's problems as our problems, but also wanted to make sure that students had both the tools and the understanding combined to help address them. And that is a mission that we continue to support today. So welcome also to the Obenshain Family Great Issues Lecture this evening. I am delighted that we have both Bill and Penny Obenshain with us today. And it's through their support, enthusiasm, and vision that we've been able to host a number of conversations this year. Bill is also famous because he has been chairing the board of the Dickey Center for, I think, almost a decade, and will only be handing the baton off to our next chair tonight. So, among the vision that he has supported, he reminded me that Jane Goodall was the first speaker in this series, soon followed by Hillary Clinton and Jake Sullivan in conversation. So we've also this year had John Barry and Kendall Hoyt talking about pandemics, looking back to look forward, as well as Michael Bromowitz, who came from Freedom House to talk to us about can we support democracy and counter-authoritarianism in the current year. So it's a very distinguished series, no less so for the guests that we have tonight. I'm very pleased that we have two distinguished thought leaders, Joe Cirincione and Kori Schake. So I will briefly introduce them both, and I will tell you that when I set this up, I thought they would be in a debate. And they advised me it's more of a conversation, because as the world changes, so do political views and alliances. And so I think we will find tonight conversation between them, areas of great agreement, great disagreement, but always respect, and I think that's something we value. Joe Cirincione, among many things, has been the president of the Plowshares Fund. He's an author, an analyst, and an expert on nuclear and international security issues. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It Is Too Late. That's a doozy. Cirincione is also the author, I understand, of over 800 articles and reports on defense and national security. He has served in senior leadership roles at the Center for American Progress and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and was a senior professional staff member in Congress, as well as taught at Georgetown University. I'm also absolutely delighted to introduce Kori Schake, who is a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Dr. Schake was the deputy director general of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's well known for her distinguished career in government as well, including serving in the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She has taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, National Defense University, University of Maryland, and I believe in Annapolis today as well. She's also very well known for her public engagement, as is Joe Cirincione. Kori, I believe, is just back from meeting President Zelensky in Ukraine, and it's hard to miss Joe on the news talking about the scenarios of a potential nuclear war. So I could not be more delighted. So in a moment, I'll introduce each speaker to give 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll have a moderated conversation. And then I'll turn to all of you in the audience so we can have an even wider conversation and a robust Q&A. So thank you for coming. Thank you for helping us celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Dickey Center and head into our next decade. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Lori. Thank you so much for inviting me up here. And thank you, Penny and Bill Obenshain, for your sponsorship of the Dickey Center and your leadership over the years, and for paying for me to come here. It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed very much my 2 days. Kori, I'm very sorry you couldn't enjoy the hospitality and intellectual stimulation of Dartmouth College. It is truly astonishing, the level of expertise and engagement here. If you are the President of the United States, you get to start your national security strategy with the phrase, "The world is at a pivotal moment." Many people, have started with phrases like that, but it has never been more true. It is more true now than when he wrote it. Since he drafted that sentence, we have seen an astonishing, unpredicted rebellion in Iran, led by young women under 25. I know of no such rebellion ever in world history. It is the largest, most sustained demonstration since 2009, some would say since 1979. It is shaking the regime to its core. They don't know what to do. This week, we have seen our relationship with a country that was the bedrock of our policy in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, shake in a way that it has not shaken since it became the center of our policy when Great Britain established Saudi Arabia at the end of World War I. That bedrock is crumbling with an anger and rapidity I have never seen. We've seen climate change devastate lands from Pakistan to Fiji to Fort Myers, reminding us that climate change is a global security risk and we still don't understand how to deal with it. And with all due respect to the President of the United States, the pandemic is not over. There are new, more virulent strains out there, and they pose tremendous global security risks. We are still plagued with the consequences of globalization that acquired an unprecedented production of material wealth in the world that went to too few people, leaving billions behind and angry. Their frustrations are fueling the rise of authoritarian and fascist movements that we haven't seen since the 1930s. And of course, we have Vladimir Putin's invasion of a peaceful, democratic, non-threatening Ukraine, the biggest land grab in Europe since Hitler seized Czechoslovakia, and Europe let him. The results of this war are going to be transformative, not just for European security, but for global security. And all these shifts relate. They're all being triggered by the shifts in the tectonic plates of geopolitics. The pressures have been building for years, but they're coming suddenly and with a vengeance. I hope that our discussion here will help illuminate some of these pivotal developments and to validate what President Biden says in the second sentence of his national security policy, that this decade will be decisive. I believe that. We need new thinking, new ideas, and I believe the Dickey Center can play a critical role in developing those ideas, both here in the academic environment of Hanover and down in the hot policy debates of Washington. And all these raise the questions of what do we do about this? What do we do? Is there anything in this world that we are willing to fight for to preserve our values, to preserve our nation, to preserve our security? For the women and people of Iran, the answer is clear. Woman, life, freedom. That's their rallying call. I believe it is the most popular hashtag in Twitter history, with some 270 million citations. Because it is a universal value. We should fight for those things. And I want you to understand as I close, I come from the anti-war perspective. I believe that U.S. wars since World War II have been largely disastrous and unnecessary and costly in lives and treasure and international legitimacy and credibility. I am an anti-imperialist. I believe in nuclear disarmament, but I am not a pacifist. There are things worth fighting for. And when a fascist dictator invades an independent country, we don't abandon them. We don't search for off-ramps for the dictator. We go and rally in support of those people. We help them win. Not to make territorial concessions to appease the dictator, but to go rescue their imprisoned people in the occupied lands. We should not be talking about occupied territory, we should be talking about occupied people. So yes, Ukraine is worth fighting for. Changes in our climate policy are worth fighting for. The freedom of the Iranian people is worth fighting for. Those are some of the values that Cory and I share. I hope we get to spend the next hour with you illuminating these and teasing out the few, perhaps significant differences that we do in how we fight and when we fight. Thank you very much.
Cory, we're delighted to be able to see you on a very large screen, so now the podium is yours.
So, first of all, Tori, thank you so much for including me in this conversation, my friend. I'm such a huge fan of what you and Dartmouth are engaged in. I wish I could be there in person, but I am in Rome actually doing something that Joe should be doing so I could be in Dartmouth, which is talking to Iranians and Saudis and American officials about how to stabilize security in the Middle East as the Iran nuclear agreement withers on the vine. So I apologize I'm not there in person. I'm especially resentful because it gives Joe so many advantages that he is there in person. Listening to Joe's very thoughtful opening comments, I have to say I was identifying the ways in which I think a little differently than he does. And maybe I'll start by clearing the decks with those. The first is that I actually do not agree that we are at the hinge of history, that things are changing faster than ever and the world is more complicated than ever. Because I feel like if you asked George Washington, John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, whether math class was hard for them, they would say math class isn't newly hard, it's always hard. And in fact, they would be willing to trade the problems they dealt with, which was an America that was not predominant in the international order, that did not have the cultural, political, and military strength to be able to orchestrate a group of like-minded countries to band together and solve common problems. I also disagreed with my good friend Joe Sorrenzioni a little bit about the Saudis, because while I do think it is disgraceful that the Saudis are assisting the Russian war effort by trying to keep oil prices high, that's what the Saudis always do. And I actually think it's a mistake that the Biden administration is so thin-skinned. They're taking this personally and engaging it as a personal affront rather than, this is what the Saudis have done since 1935, and we should be smart enough to be able to outflank them on these issues. That's our job, not theirs. A third area in which I think Joe and I have productive disagreements is that I don't agree with his diagnosis about the rise of authoritarianism. I'm a huge fan of Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History and The Last Man. And people who don't read the book very often like to deride it as history hasn't ended. But what Frank is actually arguing is a very serious political philosophy that there is no superior organization for producing safety, prosperity, and liberty than democracy and freedom. And that the risk to freedom is the last man of the title, which is what he worried about, was that those of us who live in freedom would become so lazy and self-indulgent that we wouldn't do the work of sustaining our own democracies, which feels to me to capture the present moment. The fourth area in which I think I disagree with my friend Joe Cirincione is that I am stingier about what Americans should fight for. I agree with him that we should unquestionably always be on the side of people fighting for their freedom. But whether we fight for their freedom is, I think, a slightly separate question. And I hope that questions and answers will draw this, both Joe and me, out on this. I agree with Joe on the issue of Ukraine, that this is a country fighting ferociously for their safety and their liberty. And they have earned our support. They have earned more support even than we are giving them. But I think I am more indulgent of the Biden administration's argument that keeping American forces out of this fight better serves the management of potential escalation. So I think we should help Ukrainians win this fight. And by the way, they are winning this fight. And I think we should not be fearful of the consequences of them winning this fight, namely the restoration of their internationally recognized borders. There are noises around many free governments that perhaps we should be so worried about humiliating Vladimir Putin or giving him an off-ramp that we shouldn't allow the Ukrainians the dignity of restoring their autonomy. And there are three reasons I think we ought not to be afraid of Ukraine winning. The first is they are doing our work for us. Namely, they are destroying the Russian army in a way that is making NATO countries, including the United States, much safer. And we ought to cheer them doing that work, and we ought to aid them in every way they want us to aid them in order for them to win that fight. The second reason I'm of this view is that I don't see practical uses of Russian non-strategic, so tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons that are going to make any difference in the conduct of the war. But I have to tell you, my friends, I have nightmares, and Joe, I'd be really interested in your in whether you have this same nightmare, that as Russia loses and is forced to retreat out of Ukraine's territory, I can absolutely see Vladimir Putin choosing to use a nuclear weapon against the capital of Kiev in order to be able to claim that he achieved Russia's war aims of regime change and therefore could leave Ukraine. It's a terrible, it's a terrible nightmare, but I could see Putin's logic getting him there as he loses this war. And the third thing that occurs to me about this, and that, Joe, I think you and I may differ on this one too, my friend, so I'd love to draw it out, is I really wish the President of the United States would stop publicly worrying about World War III. He's right to worry about it, and he's actually making solid choices to limit the prospects for escalation. But worrying about it in public encourages Russia to believe that making threats of nuclear escalation will intimidate us into not continuing to assist Ukraine's victory. And it also encourages other countries to realize that having nuclear weapons is the way you keep the United States at bay. And so I think a better answer that the president should be giving to the risk of nuclear use in the Ukraine war is exactly the answer the Ukrainians themselves are giving. President Zelensky said it when I was in Ukraine, talking to him with a small group of people a few weeks ago. Civil society leaders said it, business leaders said it, the military said it, and I think it's the right answer, especially since they are the ones at most risk of nuclear use. And that answer is the weapons Russia uses will not change the outcome of this war. We will continue to support Ukraine. Ukraine will continue to succeed on the battlefield because they are fighting for their liberty, and the Russian military is cratering in bad strategy, bad operational art, bad equipment, and bad political and military leadership. Okay, Joe, where do I have it wrong?
Hold on. So, yeah, good. So Joe, I'm gonna give you a chance in a second, but Corey, before we let you two start duking it out here, can I just ask you, you said quite publicly that you thought that Zelensky has made clear, as you just said, that Ukraine is fighting for its freedom, and that Putin has made it clear that Russia is fighting to destroy Ukrainian independence. So could I just push you briefly to say, what happens next? You've just given us one potential scenario. And then second, can you be a little more direct to how you describe this to the American people? Is this a fight over just borders? Is it about sovereignty? Is it a value-based foreign policy that the US believes in a rules-based international order? Is it about alliances? But if you could just give us a little bit more about your thinking, because I'm going to be looking for common ground with Joe on Ukraine before we bust out into everything else which you may not agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's all three of those things. It is about territorial integrity. It is about Ukrainian political independence, the right to choose their country's associations, alliances, economic structure. And it is also about fundamental values. You know, the difference between the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine is that President George H.W. Bush could plant a flag and say, this will not stand, because we had the conventional and nuclear dominance to prevent Iraq from continuing to occupy Kuwait. And we are properly more hesitant in dealing with a nuclear-armed Russia. And so I think for the United States, the tradecraft, the policy tradecraft on the advancement of our values, the preservation of the liberal international order that has made us and everybody else, even the people trying to overturn it, safer and prosperous, more prosperous than they have been under any other system. The challenge for the United States is determining when to commit our effort to the challenges about preservation of the order, right? In September, the Biden administration wouldn't give weapons to, September a year ago, wouldn't give weapons to Ukraine because in the professionals' judgment, Ukraine was going to lose so fast, we were just going to be handing over American equipment to Russia. By December, we weren't going to give them offensive weapons, only defensive weapons. By February, we were going to give them offensive weapons, but not ones that could reach Russian territory. By May, we were going to give them offensive weapons that could reach Russian territory, but they promised us they weren't going to use them that way. And by August, when they used them to attack Russian bases in Crimea, we said, but of course Crimea is Ukrainian territory, not Russian territory. And I think what you see in that is an increased appreciation on the part of the United States government that Ukraine is fighting so tenaciously and so courageously that they deserve more and more help for us. That this is one of those cases on the margin of the advance of liberty and the preservation of the international order, that us acting on the margin can dramatically affect the outcome And that's worth investing in.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, Joe, you've heard an argument. I want to know if you agree or not. Is this about a rules-based order, sovereignty, American values? And just to pick up on something you said, as a person who identifies as a progressive, you recently resigned from a prominent Washington think tank, the Quincy Institute, over the set of issues. And I want to give you a chance to explain that a little bit. And then I'm going to ask Joe for the scary part of the talk, which is if you could also walk through the potential scenarios that you see for the use of tactical or other nuclear weapons potentially in the region.
Let me do the latter more than the former. And Corey, first of all, I want to say you were right about Quincy. You warned me. You know, I don't agree with the way you framed it, but I really thought that this was a new institute in Washington. There was going to be a fusion of progressive internationalism and libertarian restraint, and I was wrong about that. I saw that.
No, you were right, they were wrong about it.
I was wrong. I left because I couldn't believe that they were not willing to support the Ukrainian people against this invasion. And they were more concerned about the excesses of American foreign policy and blamed the West for provoking Putin. And they were seeing this war in the frame of the failed American military interventions of the last 20 years and not understanding this is a completely different animal. This is a new situation here. We made mistakes on our policy towards Russia in the 90s and 2000s, but none of those caused this war or justify what Putin did. It is not a preventive war, as Stephen Walt says. It is not a war of limited objectives, as John Mearsheimer says. We should not be going over the heads of the Ukrainians to cut a deal with Moscow, as Quincy scholar Anatole Levin and George Beebe say. This is fundamentally, morally, diplomatically, politically, and strategically wrong. That's why I left. Just let's go to the tactical nuclear weapons, and this gets to the disagreement I have with Corey over her recent article. She just wrote an article published today, very tricky, sneaking it in an hour before the debate, in the Atlantic, which I encourage you to.
Welcome for my service, Joe.
which I encourage you to read. It's really an excellent article. It makes a number of very good points. But in the process of making those points, she insults and mocks the President of the United States, calling President Biden's loose lips to blame. Shouldn't be talking about, shouldn't be
Okay, I didn't say
publicly.
that, I wouldn't mock the President of the United States.
No, you didn't.
I am critical of him, but I don't think I'm
Publicly
mocking.
agonizing over nuclear war. You know, the headline is Biden's loose lips. Look, I have no objection to mocking and insulting presidents. I do it all the time. You know, fine, I'll withdraw the remark. What I object to is the analysis, because I think Biden is handling this perfectly, that he should be warning us about the dangers of nuclear war. I understand your concern, Corey. You're afraid that this feeds into Putin's diplomatic terror tactics. You know, because what is Putin trying to do here? I think he has three objectives here in these nuclear threats. And just keep in mind, we see daily nuclear threats from Moscow. We have seen more nuclear threats in the last 8 months from Russia than we have seen in the last 77 years from all countries combined. That's what I mean about this being different. This guy is talking about doing it. He's doing it for three reasons. One, it's a diplomatic offensive. He's trying to break the will of Ukraine, break the Western alliance that's backing Ukraine, feed into the peace sentiments in the United States, to try to break us, to try to scare us, as Tory rightly fears, make us afraid to support Ukraine as much as they deserve to be supported. The second thing he does is something Tom Nichols, our colleague up in Annapolis, pointed out in another article in The Atlantic. He's trying to normalize the use of nuclear weapons. He's saying, I'm gonna use them, I'm gonna use them, I'm gonna use them, this is why we would use them, it's a nuclear threat. The same way some politicians talk about rigged elections for months before the election, so when they lose, they say, see, I told you it's a rigged election. And you've normalized this concept. But the third reason he's doing is because he might do it. And I agree with the President of the United States, who said two things about this recently. One, in a private fundraiser. Corey doesn't think he should have said these remarks in a private fundraiser. I give her a point, he should be making an address to the nation on this. But he said that we are closer to Armageddon than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I believe that is true. I believe that is an accurate assessment. We've had lots of near misses, lots of accidents, things we didn't know were near misses until after they were over, but we have never been this close to the intentional use of nuclear weapons since 1962, this month, 60 years ago. Different framework, we're talking about global thermonuclear war, hundreds of exchanges of missiles. Here we're talking about 1, 2, a dozen, maybe escalating. Different, but still the closest use to the intentional use of nuclear weapons that we've been since then. And he also said in a conversation with Jake Tapper just a couple of days ago that he doesn't think Putin is going to do it. I also think that's correct and consistent. This is a low probability, high consequence event. The barriers to nuclear use are formidable, and the United States and other countries have been working for decades to make a nuclear taboo. You do not do this. You do not cross these lines. These weapons are beyond the pale for good reason. They're in a class by themselves. They're the indiscriminate slaughter of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians. You do not do this. And those barriers hold even for a dictator like Putin. But yet he still might do it because he has the means. He has between 1,000 and 2,000 nuclear weapons that he could use. He's got delivery mechanisms ready to use, the Iskander missiles, the KH-95, KH-101 cruise missiles that he used just this week to dig potholes in playgrounds in Kyiv. Those had conventional warheads. You could put a 20-kiloton warhead on those, the size of the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. And yes, I agree with you. He might do this. He might take out a city. You say possibility is Kyiv. That's one of 2-3 dozen possible scenarios that I'm sure we're studying. I fear that when the Ukrainians liberate Kherson, that he might hit Kherson. That might be his way of turning the tide of battle. That he would say, you think you're going to liberate this town? I'm going to destroy it. Do not advance anymore. And while I agree with you that militarily it would not have an impact, that would be a huge psychological, strategic, world-shocking event. The world would stop in its tracks. We haven't seen a nuclear weapon used in combat in 77 years. We haven't seen a nuclear explosion on the surface of the Earth since 1980, the last atmospheric test. This would be an incredible event in history.
So, Tori, may I ask Joe a question?
Please, go ahead.
I was just getting started.
I know. So please, Corey, jump in.
This is something I'm genuinely struggling with. And I agree with Joe's assessment about a low probability, high impact event. And I agree with the logic trail of how Putin, who has already crossed the most important ethical line in warfare, which is he is not fighting an army, he is purposely targeting and terrorizing the civilian population in ways that have no military value.
Right, so you can see this as a continuation of that strategy. Yeah,
that's the important ethical line that leads you to nuclear use, and Putin has already crossed it. One of the things I struggle with is what should we be doing now to strengthen deterrence, to prevent Putin from making that calculation. And in the article that Joe nicely mentioned, I try and think my way through it. And Joe, please grade my homework and tell me what we should be doing different and better than what I can think of.
No.
What I came up with was that first we should be, if we see any indications that the Russians are making the preparations for nuclear use, we should publicize that in the way we publicized their conventional preparations for the invasion of Ukraine. We should commit that if we believe the Russians are going to use a nuclear weapon, we will provide Ukraine the intelligence and military assistance for them to preempt the Russian use. Third, we should, if we fail to prevent Russia's use, we should rush NATO, chem, bio, nuclear consequence management teams to Ukraine to help deal with the terrible after effects of a nuclear use. We should orchestrate international condemnation diplomatically, and we should lift the concerns we have had on Ukraine targeting Russia's territory. And lastly, we should commit that we will assist in the hunting down and bringing to justice anybody involved in the policy decision or the execution of the order to try and break the chain between a decision and the actual use. Joe, which of those things do you think are bad ideas? What have I missed that we should be doing instead?
That's a great
I don't think any of those are bad ideas, and that's the part of your article I agree with the most. I agree, and the purpose, and I believe you say we should be articulating those now. Is that right, Corey?
Yeah, we should be really clear to the Russians so that they don't miscalculate
I
what
agree.
our choices are gonna be.
So we're, in all of this, we are assuming that deterrence theory works, that we're dealing with a rational actor who's making cost-benefit calculations. If Vladimir Putin is crazier than we think, we are in a world of hurt. Because everything we're talking about is about deterring him from doing this. And I agree with all those points, because even though we have multiple response options should he cross those lines, and I mean economic, diplomatic, cyber, psychological operations, conventional military operations in Ukraine, possibly against Russian targets, the trickiest recommendation you make, all non-nuclear, that would deliver catastrophic consequences to Russia, they all have escalatory risks. They all risk a counter-response. And the war games on this subject are not heartening. They almost inevitably escalate to further nuclear exchanges. So while you prepare your responses, whether you think the chance of him doing this is 1% or 50%, it doesn't matter. You have to do the same thing right now. Prepare your responses, but more importantly, deter him from going in the first place. And this is our fundamental agreement. I would do that, and I would also be doing what the Biden administration is doing, and I think doing very well, is building a global wall of opposition to use. Now. Doing it now. Not just communicating what we are going to do to you, but having things like the vote at the UN yesterday, condemning the annexation of Ukrainian territory. 143 nations, including many in the global south, who had been sitting on the sidelines, voted to condemn Russia. The last time there was such a resolution, in 2014, on the seizure of Crimea, we only got 100 votes. So you can see this is working. Even China and India abstained on this. The second thing you have to do is be trying to talk to China and India. Find the levers into Putin. Who does he listen to? Who has pressure on him? Talk to China and India. Tell them, friends don't let friends use nuclear weapons. You know? And China is not happy with this situation. This is not going the way they want. This is not in their strategic interest to have their partnership of unlimited partnership cause this kind of reaction in the West, where NATO is stronger than ever. The US is re-engaging militarily in Europe. The lessons for China's pressure policies on Taiwan are all negative. Their biggest ally, their biggest military ally, is now much weaker than he was before this war. This is not good for China. So use that. There's also one other thing, and I'll just stop here, which is psychological operations and cyber operations. You know, in 2003, when we invaded Iraq, we dropped aluminum chaff on the transmission wires outside Baghdad and brought down the electric grid. That's primitive by today's standards. We don't need to do that now. We have cyber weapons that can turn Moscow dark. I don't want to get over the top here, but we have a lot of cyber options. Psychological operations. In 2003, military and other officials in the US government personally called Iraqi generals at their home, telling them, we know where you live, we know where your family is, we know how to reach out and touch you, there's a future for you if you break with Saddam. I believe we should be doing all those kinds of messages. I believe we're doing some of them now to try to increase the fissures that are showing up in Putin's regime. He is much weaker now than he was at any time in the last 20 years, and including in Russian society, where 2 or 3 times as many Russian men have fled the country than have been conscripted to the front lines. He is in deep trouble, and we have to press all those levels, and that's why, here I'll close, it's important for the president to talk about the stakes, to talk about the possibility here, because Putin is trying to normalize nuclear weapons, we're trying to increase the taboo. We're trying to say how terrible this is, how horrible it is, and that's why we have to do everything we can now to make sure not to make sure nuclear weapons doesn't happen, to make sure that Putin doesn't start a nuclear war. So I think the president's on the right track with this.
Well, that is a great segue to my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, there's a few critiques of the area that you two agree on, which is fantastic. And you know, the nations of the world did vote with the condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And an earlier resolution, as well as the one you cited this week. But a lot of countries are like, why is this only about Ukraine? Why about the rest of the world? The values you're describing, the harm to civilians, the deprivation, the lack of governance, the authoritarianism is not just in Ukraine. And so I'd love you both to reflect on that through the lens of thinking about the national security strategy. So the United States just released, I think it was formally yesterday, so you should be forgiven for not having read all of it. But the Biden administration tries to square the circle a bit by saying, we will work with allies and partners. We will support a rules-based international order. We will stand up and support institutions from the UN and NATO to other alliances. And we will work with any other country that believes in a rules-based order. They didn't say exactly democracy. So I'm curious, both of you who think at the strategic level, does that answer the critique of why only Ukraine for you? Or would you say, well, no, I actually also care, not just about China and Saudi Arabia, but what's happening in other parts of the world? That's complex enough.
Joe, do you want to take the first swing, or do you want me to?
I'll be real short. I mean, we care about Ukraine because it's Europe. I mean, this is our core interest, and it's not necessarily. Well, I guess I don't. I think it is right.
It's not sovereignty.
It's sovereign. I don't know. I'm not an international theorist. I really appreciated listening to the international theorists at Dartmouth, but I'm just a practicalist. I'm looking for solutions that will let people live in peace and freedom and security and free of nuclear annihilation. Let's talk about things that might work. So for Europe, this is core for the United States. You cannot allow this breach of the rules that we've created since World War II. You cannot let this happen. It cannot stand. And you know, George H.W. Bush made the same kind of argument with Kuwait that Tori mentioned. And I think the national security team that Biden has assembled gets this. And in fact, I think this is the finest national security team we've had since George H.W. Bush team, which set a very high bar. So I feel they get it, they feel they understand it. I know they would like to move on to address these other issues, these other sovereignty issues, social inequity issues, global distribution of wealth issues. But this is what they have to focus on now. This is the nuclear boulder in the road.
Corey.
So, I probably assess the quality of this national security team differently than Joe does. My answer to the question is that it is true that the United States cares more about Ukraine than we care about similar horrific circumstances in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, and in many other places. And I think there are 3 reasons for it. The first, I agree with Joe, Europe is the region of the world the United States cares most about. It's where our closest friends are. It's where the states that most profoundly share our political, cultural, and social values are. it's the place where the United States cannot afford to have the regional security order upended, because the consequences for our own safety and our own prosperity are too enormous. So the folks who say Europe can take care of Europe, the US should focus on China, I think the piece they miss is that no American security guarantee anywhere will be considered reliable if we don't honor our security commitments in Europe. Because as Joe said, everybody knows these are our closest friends. And it has consequences both for our safety and our economy. I think the hard, unpleasant truth is that for the United States, we have the good fortune of fabulous neighbors and incredible security provided by a continental expanse, oceans on two sides, and magnificent neighbors on the other two sides. And so we very rarely run the risk of existential wars. But we are so much safer by fighting wars about the shape of the international order, by caring about other people's liberty and prosperity, and trying to create an order, as Condi Rice nicely put it, where the balance falls on the side of freedom. But the hard truth is the United States can't and shouldn't do it everywhere. And we make policy decisions based on, do we think we can achieve important things with limited commitments? And I think one of the reasons there was a backlash against the Iraq War is that it felt like what we were committing in order to achieve the objectives was out of proportion with the objectives. And I think Afghanistan, by the time the Biden administration abandoned it, what we were committing was by that time very small. But it's perfectly fair for the president to say that still felt like too much given what we were achieving. And so we do make choices, and we should make choices, because we're talking about $40 billion of assistance to Ukraine. We are talking about American casualties in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the American public has a right to be stingy about those things.
Well, thank you both, Corey and Joe, for kicking this off. I'd like to now turn to those of you in the room to see if you'd like to join the conversation. I see right up here, first of all, Tony.
This is not a shy crowd. Wow.
Well, thank you, to begin with, thank you both of you for what was a very stimulating presentation of your points of view. And I would say a pretty succinct presentation. What I didn't see, really, what it was hard for me to see, was there any differences in your point of view. It seemed to me that you both believe that this is worth fighting for. It seems to me that you both believe that the goals and the reasons for fighting for it are the same. It seems to me even that what you would do, which is, unless you clarify it, not fight the war ourselves, but provide all means for the Ukrainians to fight the war. There's no difference with that either. But just so that I test the last thing, because you also believe that your greatest fear is what you both term to be a low probability but high consequence event. So I fail to see any differences. For me, the question really is where do you draw the line? And that plays into the issue of how to manage the low probability unless you're willing to run the risk.
Yeah.
And that comes down to, and I don't want to use the word, the Czechoslovakia was invoked. It's some form of appeasement, but even certainly conceding territory, but doesn't seem you want to concede that, maybe not even the Crimea. So the issue for me is the appeasement could come in the form of backing off of the kind of support that we are giving Ukraine the armaments, the types of armaments. So for me, if there's a difference between you, it sounds like of a political nature, your different views on the different teams or how people say things, but I want to understand and tease out what is the fundamental
Thanks.
difference.
Before we go there, let me take another question or two if we have any others. I see a hand back here, it looks like a student. Two of them, yeah.
Thank you guys so much for coming. First of all, anytime George H.W. Bush is mentioned, I'm overjoyed because he's my favorite president. I love what he stood for. I think he belongs on Mount Rushmore for what he accomplished during his 4 years. Probably Henry Kissinger said it was the most complex 4 years internationally since FDR presided over the end of World War II.
It was a pivotal moment.
So it's also just domestic policy, huge accomplishments there. But my question is, obviously you see the President of the United States sort of articulating his fears over nuclear Armageddon, and you can say whether or not that's appropriate or not, but I think with Biden, would you say it's an accurate assessment that we should be grateful that a president of the Cold War generation is in office right now, who sort of understands what it means to have somebody like Putin or Stalin or Khrushchev making nuclear threats at us? And also, do Americans on the large part still believe in what JFK said, we will pay any price or bear any burden for the protection and preservation of liberty throughout the world? Do we still believe that? Because honestly, from my point of view, at first I was scared, honestly, when you hear Putin waving the nuclear weapons, because you haven't seen that, my generation hasn't. But then, what do we
Okay, I want to take the first swing at that one.
All right. Why don't we go with those two, and then I don't want to lose the person here who had hand up. Okay, go ahead, Corey.
So the first thing is I want to scold you for your ageism. You don't need to be a child of the Cold War to be able to understand these stakes, as your question just pointed out to all of us. So I reject that part of it. The second thing is JFK actually didn't believe in bearing any burden and paying any price. As you can see during the Berlin crisis in 1961, when he consented to the long-term division of Germany, and you can see it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he found a creative way not to have to carry out the threats he had made. So I think we sometimes get caught up in the rhetoric of bearing any price and bearing any burden, and we actually shouldn't bear any burden or pay any price. We ought always to be assessing, is this a price worth paying? Do the risks actually balance with the costs? And that takes me to the first question, which is where I think I hear a disagreement between Joe and me is how to respond to the overt nuclear threat that Vladimir Putin is continuously making. I actually think it's incredibly unhelpful for President Biden to be worrying in public about Armageddon or the biggest risk since the Cuban Missile Crisis, or fear of World War III. Because what that does is reward the making of nuclear threats of escalation. I think the right answer, whether to North Korea or Russia or Iran, is the weapons you use will make no difference to our commitment to Ukraine's success, South Korea's security, any other American interest you want to support. Because otherwise we incentivize proliferation, we encourage efforts at nuclear blackmail, and we demonstrate what we are afraid of, and we ought instead to have the perspective, we're actually the strong and successful ones in this equation. It is Russia who should be more worried, because the macho Russian military is getting their asses kicked by the transvestites and ballerinas in the military. And by the way, Jason Lyle's magnificent book is The Smartest Way to Understand Who Wins Wars, his terrific book, Divided Armies. Inclusion is what creates successful fighting forces. And the Russians don't have it, and the Ukrainians do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Corey. Joe, how would you like to tackle those two questions?
Well, let me, there's a lot of people who want to ask questions, so let me just try to expand the conversation a bit and to look at some differences we may have that we haven't touched on yet. And I believe those differences might go to the role of the US in the world and in global security after Ukraine wins. I think we have to start thinking about that. I don't see a lot of thinking about that, certainly not in Washington think tanks, and this is a role that I think the Dickey Center could play a role in. Let's start, what does it look like after Putin loses? If we escape nuclear war, Putin loses, Ukraine wins. Timothy Snyder has a wonderful article in Foreign Affairs saying that what a great global victory this will be for democracy at a time when democracies are being challenged by authoritarian movements and governments around the world. This is extremely significant. Let's dig into that. We may differ, Corey, on the role of United States in European security. If Russia is defeated and its army crumbles, as I think it will, I've never seen the army look this fragile. What does that mean about the U.S. military involvement in Europe? Do we rush troops back to Europe? Do we build up? Or do we find ways to get the Europeans to take more responsibility, not just monetarily, but physically, strategically, organizationally for their security? And do we do more, what some call offshore balancing? Does this allow us to reduce our defense budget? Here's where we differ. Corey likes the military budget the way it is. I think the military budget is obscene and indefensible. $850 billion. It was $300 billion before 9/11. It's risen to unsustainable levels. We need that money for other things in America to address other actions. I would cut the US military. Yes, cut the military budget, because when I say fight for freedom and democracy, I don't mean necessarily physically fight, conventional, I mean economically, diplomatically, politically, culturally. Those are ways of fighting as well. Nuclear weapons. In your article, Corey, you bemoan the fact that you think Russia has 10 times the tactical nuclear weapons we have. It's actually, we have about 250, they have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000, but more doesn't matter with nuclear weapons. After a certain point, it doesn't matter that they have 1,000 nuclear weapons. You don't need that many. Look what we're talking about here. So I would be cutting the nuclear arsenal. Yes, even unilaterally cutting, and understand the mistake we made when Reagan and Gorbachev, this month in 1987, came very close to eliminating nuclear weapons. They finished the job. We cut the arsenals from 70,000 globally to 13,000. That's wonderful, but we left Putin with 6,000 nuclear weapons total. Let's understand that that was a mistake, that this is what is empowering his aggression. Nuclear weapons are not our greatest security, they are our greatest threat. They are blocking us from doing the things we need to do in the world, and we should recommit to never using a nuclear weapon first, no first use, and to cutting the nuclear arsenals in global negotiations. And I would say we can reduce our stockpile unilaterally by about 1/3 without sacrificing any military missions.
Okay, Corey, before I let you come back, because I think you will not forget that list, let me go back out to the audience. I saw one student on the end. I think Tom may have a call, some from online. I thought I saw Sarah's hand in there, but maybe. So let's start here, okay.
Hi there, I'm Kyle, I'm a senior here at Dartmouth. Thank you both for coming in and talking to us today. I don't know where I'm supposed to look for the camera purposes, but I wanted to ask to expand the conversation even a little further. Joe, you mentioned the Iranian protests in your introduction, and we talked a lot about Ukraine, so I want to maybe pivot a little bit to ask about, what action should the U.S. be taking, if any, in response to the situation in Iran for both of you. And I mean, keeping in mind the fact that the U.S. has sort of a long history of arming a little rebel group over here and sponsoring a coup over here, and then it goes very, very poorly for the people on the ground, and decades later, have a civil war in an undeveloped country and economy. So I'm kind of wondering, what, if anything, how should we as Americans be thinking about the situation in Iran, and how should policymakers be thinking about it?
Okay, I'm gonna try and pack in a lot of questions and then you all will get a chance. Tom, do you have a microphone?
Yes, this one's in, back to Russia. What are the chances that the Russian people would or could overthrow Putin themselves?
Okay, fantastic. If you could hand that back to Sarah, who's right behind you, and then I'll come over here, I see a couple students with hands.
Thank you both for your talk. I wanted to switch gears and talk about conventional warfare slightly. I heard in a meeting recently, spoken by Henry Kissinger himself, the notion that currently the Ukraine possesses the largest standing army in Europe and will, in a scenario whereby Russia loses in the medium term. How does that change the security dynamics for the US on the European continent? Thank you.
That's a great question. All right, and right over here.
Hello, my name's Arjun, I'm a freshman here. My question is, obviously the US and Western countries have placed a lot of sanctions on Russia, whether it be economically, freezing Russia's reserves in Western countries, whether that be sanctioning people close to Putin. But at the same time, it seems to me that President Biden has sort of been easing a bit on China. Earlier this year, he dropped a lot of the tariffs that were placed on China during Trump's presidency for reasons of trying to curb inflation. Also, there doesn't really seem to be an organized American effort to counter China yet that Biden has presented. Obviously, he's presented, his Indo-Pacific framework, but there still is yet to be, a coordinated effort, I think, to counter China by Biden. So I think my question here is, should we really be focusing this much on Russia when China is clearly the bigger issue for the longer term? And really, how much energy should we be devoting to Russia when I think that China is the much bigger issue here?
All right, fantastic. Well, we've expanded the conversation, and I think China has been something that you both have had debates about in regards to national security strategy, trying to lay that out as well. But
Can we start with Iran?
Yes, Joe.
Because I want to hear what Corey's, I want you to tell us all the secret conversations you're having. In Rome, by the way, is that where you said you were? Rome.
Yes, because it's
Yeah,
really.
okay, that's it, I don't want to hear it. That's it. Rome. We have many, many differences with Iran. Fundamental, ideological, political, all kinds of differences. But all the differences we have with Iran are so much worse if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. So that's why the chief objective of US foreign policy was to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and we did that. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, agreed to in 2015, is the strongest non-proliferation regime ever negotiated. It rolled back the program, froze it for a generation, put it under lock and camera. They were not going to get a bomb under this deal. There was not going to be a war over them getting a bomb. President Trump pulled out of the deal, thought he had a better plan. He did not. Maximum pressure was a complete disaster. Iran is now closer to a bomb than they ever have been, and the risks of war with Iran started to grow. The US, after fits and starts and hesitations, finally started negotiating again. We have put a good offer on the table. Iran has rejected that offer. I bet President Raisi is rethinking that decision now as his regime is under incredible stress. Wouldn't it be nice to have lifted those sanctions? Wouldn't it be nice to have economic benefits? And here, Corey, as much as I care about that deal, now is not the time to be pushing that deal. I think the State Department had the right response the other day when Ned Price, the spokesperson, said it is not our chief focus right now. There is too much else going on in Iran right now. We have no need to go back to Iran. Let's see if Raisi changes it, where we may differ. Let me tell me about this. Is our good friend Kareem Sajanpour said that we should not agree at all. Take the deal off the table. So giving this agreement to Raisi now, even if he agrees to our terms, would be a lifeline to his regime. It would be a stab in the back to the Iranian people. I'm a little more fond of American security objectives. I think we want to stop Iran from getting a bomb, and if we can do that, we should do that, and in the long run, the deal and the economic incentives and the engagement with Iran will be to the benefit of the democratic and freedom movements in Iran, not a stab in the back. What are you hearing in Rome? What are you thinking right now?
So one of the delicious ironies of the national security strategy is that it was written by Tom Wright, a really good guy who wrote a really good book called All Measures Short of War, in which he argues that no country should ever believe that the United States isn't working towards regime change in repressive governments. And the big headline out of the national security strategy is the US forgoes regime change as a policy objective. So I love it that Tom said no state should ever believe that of the United States, and then wrote a strategy that's the headline in. Because welcome to Washington. I agree with Joe that that we have an overriding interest in preventing an Iranian nuclear weapons program. I am skeptical about the future of returning to the JCPOA. I personally think it was a mistake that the Biden administration on January 21st didn't just rejoin the agreement.
We are in exact agreement. They rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, they should have joined JCPOA. This problem would be behind us by now.
Absolutely, and instead, Jake
stunned by
Sullivan
this.
and the president argued, we need a longer, stronger agreement, and the Iranians also said the existing agreement isn't good enough. Where it connects to the protests in Iran, though, is I cannot see the political possibility of us ending sanctions on Iran as we committed to in the JCPOA while Iran is killing young protesters. I just don't see any president able to sign that legislation right now. What I think we should be doing to assist Iranian protesters, if you don't follow AEI's Critical Threats Project, we are mapping, using open source information in Farsi, we are mapping where the Iranian protests are occurring and assessing the severity of the risk to the regime's continued control of the country. You know, we live in such a great age of open source intelligence assessments. Bellingcat, the Institute for the Study of War, Critical Threats, the power of civic activism to share information. And I agree with something Joe said earlier, which is the superpower of free societies is actually values and civic activism, right? My favorite thing ever written on American foreign policy is a novel from the 1960s, a bad novel from the 1950s, called The Ugly American, in which this precious advice is given. To the extent American policy is humane and reasonable, it will succeed. And to the extent it is grandiose and ideological, it will fail. We shouldn't be cheering for the regime to fall. We should be helping protesters figure out how to get information, how to get VPN access so they can cloak their own movements, how to shield their personal identities from their government. That's a complicated thing to do because you don't want terrorists to be able to do that. But we do have tools we can use to assist people yearning for freedom. And that's much more important than sending them weapons, arguing for the overthrow of the government. Humane and reasonable assistance to people who are acting courageously in the face of repression and is the right way to help. Okay, overthrowing Putin. I promise I will go faster, Tori. I can see you getting nervous. Overthrowing Putin. I pray for it. I ardently yearn for it. I do not think it should be an objective of American policy at the moment, for two reasons. First, because I worry about that as a stated policy objective. And second is because it looks to me like Putin's hold on power is cracking, and he's going to be overthrown from the right, not from the left. So we could end up with a worse Russian government than we have. And, you know, a good strategist is a desperate paranoiac, somebody who's always worrying that things could be worse than they are now. And so we need to worry about that. Third, Kissinger's statement about Ukraine having the largest army in Europe. I'm not sure that's actually technically true. And I basically feel about Henry Kissinger the way Tom Lehrer did. When Lehrer was asked why he stopped writing biting satirical songs, he said, when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Prize for Peace, satire lost its meaning. But I do think it's a very good question. And as Joe said, we are not thinking enough about European security after Ukraine wins. What role does Russia play in that Europe? You know, the balance of power within NATO has shifted from the Franco-German border to Poland and Estonia's eastern border. And so how are we going to deal with questions like wanting stationing of nuclear weapons on the frontier rather than in Belgium, Italy, and other places? Those are really important questions that we and allies need to carefully think our way through, and I think we haven't done that yet. And lastly, on China and economic policy, I love that question. Well done, well done, well done. I think that's super smart. But the United States, you know, if we could only worry about China, we would be a regional power. We wouldn't be a global power, and we wouldn't be the global hegemon. We actually have the ability to, and the resources and the capacity to do more than one thing at once. And we shouldn't write off Europe in order to manage China, because that by itself will send China really important signals about our ability to protect and advance our interests. I would encourage you to read two great articles in Foreign Affairs. One by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley, based on their book, arguing that China's economy is stalling, and historically, it's stalling powers who are the greatest danger to international security. And the best rebuttal to that is by two others of my amazing AEI team, Oriana Schuyler Mastro and Derek Scissors, who also bring a data-driven argument to Foreign Affairs, saying, yeah, China's stalling, but it's going to stall for the next 40 years, and there's no trigger to suggest that they're a particular danger now. It helped me think through these questions of balance and strategy, and I hope it will help you as well.
Well, Corey, thank you so much, and Michael Beckley is actually a graduate of the Dickey Postgraduate Fellowship, so nice call out for you. We are not running low on enthusiasm, but we are running low on time, so I'm going to give Joe a final word here, and I would give you, if you had one more thing you wanted to say, but I think we're going to have to wrap this up, unfortunately.
Just on China, and I'll be real quick, I think President Biden has the right understanding of what we have to do to compete with China. You see the way they talk about China in the national security strategy as a competitor. And his answer to this is that in order to compete with China, we have to start at home. That this is not primarily a military competition. This is economic, diplomatic. We have to strengthen ourselves at home. So you hear him talk about a foreign policy for the middle class. When Jake Sullivan was introduced as the National Security Advisor in November 2020, he said that Biden had charged the team with reimagining national security to include all the security threats we face: pandemics, climate change, racial injustice, attacks on democracy, income inequities. And he's right about that. We're our own worst enemy in this global competition. We're getting killed from within, connected to some of the authoritarian movements that are rising in the world, but this kind of political divisiveness that has risen to an extreme case where one of the major political parties rejects democracy, rejects elections. You cannot compete with China with this kind of weakness at home. So he understands that, he's just been unable to do it. He's just been unable to do it. He's kept the military budget high, he's tried to restore US partnerships and cooperation, I say foolishly in the case of his Saudi Arabia trip, but he's tried to do it, he's been unable to implement it because of these divisions at home, and unfortunately, I think these divisions are going to get worse. So he has the right idea, he doesn't have the right implementation of that idea.
Well, I have to thank you both, because what you've also demonstrated is we're in a time of significant change, whether it's totally a complete change as Joe has described or Corey's not so sure of, but it also is time that ideas matter. And you both have articulated why the research and the academic world that many of us are in, working with policymakers and for the next generation of students, rather than be daunted by this, I think you've laid out why it's important that we all be involved in it. I also hear some research projects, Joe and Corey, you've laid at the feet of Dartmouth, so I think maybe we will pick this up again, invite you back, and maybe keep the conversation going. So please join me in thanking our two fantastic guests.